work that their office does and why they're here today. And at some point, I might ask some clarifying questions within the intros. Then we'll dive right into the intricacies about this work in youth adult justice. At the end of our discussion, we'll have 10 minutes of question and answer from the audience. So first, let's start with Greg. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'll be brief to let my partner, Isael, otherwise known as Swizz, talk a little bit more about his experience. But it's great to be here, and so many good partners allow us to do this work. In terms of innovation in young adult justice, I'd say that we're really, really fortunate to be up in the Merrimack Valley because we got a couple of different things going on simultaneously that seem to be well aligned. And I just want to thank our partners with Probation, in the trial court, and so many others here, Executive Office of Public Safety, that have helped us allow us to do this. So 2 things I would highlight. I think in talking to folks about young adult justice, which is a term now that's probably being used a little bit more and more, whatever your stance is on different policies, I think when folks hear about what the treatment of a 19-year-old is versus a 49-year-old while they're incarcerated or in the court system, most people nod their heads that it probably should be a little different. And I think that's the heart of what we're doing. We're fortunate to partner with Sheriff Katujan in Billerica in the House of Corrections, which has the first ever county jail that has a specialized unit, where we have street workers that go in, meet with young people, and our goal is to expand upon that, in essence, kind of bring the UTEC model behind the walls and provide that continuum in the post-release. And in partnership with Probation, I'll let the Commissioner talk more in detail, we have this really now brand new partnership, another kind of first in the country pilot in a learning lab to see how a community-based organization to work with specialized young adult probation work. And so we're super appreciative. We know that young adults are the highest recidivism rate, as we all know, but we also know that the biggest stat to me is always, as a former street worker, you see it every day, that in your mid-20s, there's something that happens and recidivism naturally declines. So at the heart of everything we do is just wrap our arms around the young adults we work with and make sure they're not going back to jail and they're not having charges that might affect them for the rest of their life. So pleased to be here. I really appreciate the partnership and the leadership of Mass Inc. And I'll turn it over to my partner, Swizz, who'll share a little bit about his story as well.
Thank you.
Hi, how's it going? So I'm just gonna state what I do. I'm in the wood shop right now. It's doing really good. This program really helped me out a lot. I had gotten incarcerated, and I was waiting to get into UTEC before, but once I got incarcerated, they helped me out a lot. They seen that that I was in a tough position, and my TC had really connected with my PO and just figured out ways how we could maintain me staying on the right level. I've been doing this program for a year, and it's really kept me in line, and I really think a lot of people deserve this opportunity. These people are mad supportive. They help you out. Even it's more in depth than just the program itself. I got involved because I really wanted to just change my life. I wanted to get my high set. I wanted to, get over this probation stuff that I'm dealing with, and they've been really supporting me the whole way, and it's helpful. Ever since I got here, I've been learning some new things, like in the wood shop. I know that it's getting me more structured, you know what I'm saying? This is awesome. It's worth it.
Thank you, Isael. So thank you so much for that. It seems like there's a lot of different models around helping young people not just survive but thrive in the criminal justice world with diversion, youth courts, young adult probation, and units. And the rest of you folks, if you could just maybe touch upon your part in all of this, that would be fantastic. Next up, we have Commissioner Dolan to talk about some of his work.
Thanks, Sarah. So Ed Dolan, Commissioner of Probation. I won't give you the whole infomercial about probation, but we're in 3 adult courts, juvenile, probate, and family court. On any given day, we have about 60,000 people that we're involved with, and they range from 12 years old to, well, actually even younger than that if you count care and protection, and all the way up to folks in their 80s. So, a developmental, if we want to be effective with those people, with everybody in that range, taking a human developmental approach is key for us. We focus on risk and need and responsivity, and our, really sort of see ourselves in the human development business. And so a lot of what we do is geared to changing folks' attitudes, values, beliefs, and through that changing their behavior. And so to be effective, you really need to know who you have and who you're working with. And we know from other research and CSG and from our partners that this is a particularly volatile age group, and there are lots of things that are very specific to the 18 to 24-year-old age group. And if we want to be effective, we need to deliver on those. And so that's really, Greg mentioned our learning lab with UTEC. So it's our task is really to partner with folks to learn what's effective and then figure out how to deliver that in 300 and somebody in the room will know this, 356 cities and towns in the Commonwealth, to the folks that we serve. And so to have partners is key for us. Our involvement tends to be time limited, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever. And so one of the things that we really try to do is put in place those systems and supports like UTEC, ROCA, More Than Words, the work that I know that the district attorney is going to talk about, and put in things that will live and continue that sort of trajectory of change that we try to initiate with the young adults that come into our care and custody. And so after the probation stuff is over, that's really, that's going to continue that work and continue that sort of reorientation from an antisocial orientation to the world to a more pro-social orientation to the world. And that's really conceptually how we view our work. And this is an important population for us. There were, I'll give you a little data, 2017, 23,000 18 to 24-year-old arraigned in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So it's a big population. They run the gamut from, public disorder and a lot of motor vehicle-related offenses, all the way up to about a quarter of them are person crimes. So it's an important group for us and has a public safety impact and also a public welfare impact as well. So anyway, that's our work.
Thank you. And with that, sort of transitioning into some of the work around young adult courts is the district attorney from Hampden County.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. I'm Anthony Gulluni. I'm the Hampden District Attorney. I want to give folks a little bit of background about my jurisdiction just before we start, and I want to note that, Sarah, you told us 5 minutes to introduce, so you're going to have trouble keeping me to 2 or 5. But Hampden County has Springfield as its metropolitan center. Contrary to belief in the Boston area, it does not border Canada. It's actually in western central Massachusetts. It's not that far from here, in fact. It's a county of about 500,000 people. Again, Springfield is the city at the heart of it with about 150, 160,000 people. My system and the court system overall is one of the busiest, if not the busiest, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with no exclusions, which tells you about a little bit what we're dealing with. It's a challenged population. There's a great deal of poverty. There's a great deal of addiction and many issues that contribute to the busyness of the court system. I'm in my second 4-year term, the first year of my second 4-year term, and about 18 months ago we started a program. It really started as a roundtable discussion around what we can do better for emerging adults, based fundamentally on the science that we all know about now, the brain science, or about the developing brain, and the fact that these young people, 19, 20, 21 years old, all the way up to 24 and 25, are still dealing with the development of the brain and don't have the same understandings. They don't process information the same way. They don't understand consequences and so on and so forth as do 30 or 40 or 50-year-olds. So I think we have this fundamental understanding that this is a distinct population, distinct from juveniles, but also distinct from older adults, and that in the court system we can do something much better for them. And as a prosecutor prior to being district attorney, and as working in diversion prior to going to law school, I think I've seen with my own eyes and through my work that this population, especially in my jurisdiction in places like Holyoke and Springfield, are going through a cycle where they're typically starting in juvenile court. They're ending up in district court as adults committing multiple offenses. Those offenses get more serious. Consequences go from probation to incarceration, and then almost inevitably they end up in superior court with indicted offenses, and most of their 20s and 30s are spent in and out of prison, in and out of jail. So we wanted to interrupt this, and that was the discussion. It really spun off the Chelsea Working Group, where Chief Justice Carey has been involved, ROCA has been involved, numerous partners. So we started our own in Western Massachusetts with various partners, including the Sheriff's Department, police departments, my office, of course, and it really turned into a discussion about a young adult court. And folks in that group were familiar with what San Francisco was doing and some other jurisdictions. So now we're at the precipice of a launch. We're really probably 2 or 3 months away. We're shooting for July. It may be August. It may be September. Obviously, the logistics are very broad. But we're in partnership, and without the partnerships, we wouldn't be where we are. The probation department, as Commissioner Dolan mentioned, is an absolutely critical and fantastic partner. ROCA has been a pillar of this program, and various partners. But what we're going to do is have an emerging adult court, what we've dubbed the Emerging Adult Court of Hope, or EACH as an acronym. And it's going to serve 18 to 24-year-olds who are committing serious offenses. This is not a diversion program. This is not for low-risk offenders. This is, in fact, for high-risk offenders, because we realize we need to leverage over these young people. Because if they come in at 18, 19, 20 years old with the lack of capacity to understand consequences of convictions and so on and so forth, they're not going to join this program, which is going to involve intensive probation, intensive programming around career development, substance use issues, mental health, etc. So we're talking about high-risk offenders who typically have lengthy records and have committed somewhat serious offenses. And we're talking about gun offenses, we're talking about serious drug offenses. So this is high risk also for the participants and for me as an elected official. But our belief is that we can interrupt the cycle of incarceration for these young people. We can make a real difference for these young people if we interrupt this cycle with an intensive program where they have to buy in. But we have that leverage over them, so they have to buy in many ways, and it's the only alternative to incarceration. And we think if we pair in career development, and I think there's a significant difference between a job and a career. Most of these young men are hopeless. They don't have any positive role models around them. They don't have any sense of a career or sense of a future. So if we can get them real career training that can give them the hope of a gainful employment, a way to support themselves and their families down the road, we think that to them is a better alternative to being on the street and committing crimes as they have. So it's at the final stages, believe it or not. This will be certainly the first in the Commonwealth and one of a handful in the entire country. We're very, very excited about it, and we really believe we're going to change young people's lives with it.
Thank you, and we will get back to that topic in a few minutes. So next I'd like to introduce Erin. I know your organization, Communities for Restorative Justice, works hand in hand with police departments and extensively with the Middlesex and Suffolk DAs in caseload referrals. How effective is restorative justice in what you're doing, and how do you see it relating to the rest of what is being talked about here as you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, so restorative justice is a philosophy based on the principles that you should involve the people who are most intimately involved in an incident, and start by asking those involved how they would like it to be resolved, and asking the victims what they need and what they want to be able to move forward, to increase that sense of safety, to be able to find a way towards healing, to be able to find a way to become more whole again after an incident occurs. Our program started as a community police partnership. We started in Concord 20 years ago, and over the last 2 decades have grown through Middlesex County We have a partner in Norfolk County, and then over the last 18 months to 2 years have transitioned into Suffolk County. And we have 24 different police departments who can directly refer to C4RJ. And then the district attorney's office in Middlesex County and Suffolk County can also refer through their diversion programs, whether that be juvenile or young adult. And the great thing is with our program is that we don't limit access. We keep our arms open wide, and we'll work with any case that our referring partners want to try to use restorative justice to resolve. And that means that we've worked with people as young as 8 and as old as 80. And we've, last year, for example, 60% of our cases were felony offenses, and about a quarter of the population that we worked with were in that 18 to 25-year-old age bracket that we're specifically talking about today. And C4RJ as a model, as far as whether or not it is effective in changing the outcome of someone's future, the trajectory of their decision making, our recidivism rate is 16%. Now I'll leave you to the study, to your own devices to find a study, to find a statistics for the criminal justice system, but restorative justice is more successful at changing that recidivism outlook because you have a face associated with an incident, and you have a story, and you have a person when you think about what happened and what went wrong. Restorative justice has really gained a lot of momentum since the criminal justice reform bill, because it was pretty common to think about restorative justice as a diversionary option before that. But the restorative justice legislation that passed last April as part of the comprehensive criminal justice reform package opened up restorative justice as an option in the criminal code for cases past arraignment. And so that really opens up the possibility to think about more and more people with past criminal records, more and more people that have moderate to higher risk offenses and histories, and really opens up the potential for the outcomes to continue being successful.
Thank you. And so I know Erin and the DA both sort of talked about this briefly, but how open is the public and in turn the criminal justice system to treating young adults differently than adults? And feel free between the few of you to just start speaking.
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah.
I think the public, to a large extent, and you can't consider everybody the same, but I think a lot of people understand the issues that young people are facing and the sort of prominence that they play in the criminal justice system, and that to a large degree what we're doing now isn't working, especially for emerging adults. So I think there's an appetite there, at least with the folks I'm talking to, and the sense I get from my electorate, that there's an appetite to do something different. I think there's risk involved, and I think people are focused on their public safety and their own safety. But if we can do something that really focuses on people's lives and turns them around, especially with regard to the knowledge that young people are recidivating at an incredible rate. So something has to be done. Something has to be done differently. And a lot of these folks really need something more than just what we're doing, now in the criminal justice system.
And I think it's success stories just like yours that convince people, because it's really easy for us to think about giving juveniles another chance. It's a little bit harder for us to think about those 18 to 25-year-old adults. And it's really challenging for us to give adults, older age adults, middle-aged adults, a second chance. And it's important for us to think about our own lives and times where we might have made a misstep and needed that second chance. And then it starts to become a little bit more comfortable. I think the language around young adults, the 18 to 25-year-old bracket, because of the brain research and the development research, the executive functioning development that is happening during that age bracket, I think the conversation is more and more comfortable now than it was 5 years ago. And I'm finding that partners that we worked with who would only think about restorative justice for under 18-year-olds are now much more willing to think about it for 18 to 25-year-olds and even older.
Greg?
I think I agree with everyone's comments. I think, we've seen it, as a street worker, you see young adults when they leave incarceration, they come back to UTEC, what that kind of, we say like what that light bulb moment is, right? And that might be when unfortunately a young person's shot, when unfortunately they're coming out of the funeral home of a friend, or they become a parent, right? There are those moments, and I think, a big part of everything we're trying to do is to basically stick with that young person no matter what. And I think the work that you can do, everything we do is to try to make sure young people aren't going back to jail. But if they are, I think there is, and the work that we're all doing here together is to do more work, more programming behind the walls, and to have that partnership upon post-release, so that when that light bulb moment comes on, someone's there, right? And we see it day in, day out. The street workers build the relationships with young adults while they're incarcerated. Unfortunately, we see the same narrative where a young adult says, the folks that I thought were going to be there aren't going to be there. And if it's a street worker, a family member, that same person behind the walls and that same person post-release can make the difference of carrying them into whatever the next kind of stage is. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do.
So just to add to that, I agree with everything everybody said. I think that the research, you look at the polling research, and I think that being sort of part of the system, the pressure, or I think the expectation from the public is that they want us to be effective, right? So I think it's less of a punitive orientation than I don't want it to happen again. And so you see in the in the research literature, polling, why don't you help them? Intervene, be effective in your intervention, and I think that sort of has been the engine behind a lot of the work that we're trying to do together. And it's all about intervening, right? Intervening early and redirecting young adults in the path that they're on. But I think that's the expectation and sort of the demand from the public. Okay, just be effective. I don't, the offense is behind us. I don't want it to be reoffending. And I'm sure you get that in restorative justice. People are remarkably gracious about, I'm going to say forgiving people, but I just don't want it to happen again. I don't want it to happen to somebody else. I don't want it to happen to me. And so I think effectiveness and that focus is sort of what I think all of us are about.
So looking at alternatives to incarceration, this is a question for the commissioner, but also if anyone also wants to jump in, how does probation have a role in all of this, and how can probation be used as an effective model as opposed to incarceration? I know that there's the choice program in the Roxbury division of the Boston Municipal Court and other education programs, but how can you really apply probation as a form or a method of reducing recidivism? Anyone jump right in?
So I'll go first. We see probation is the alternative to incarceration. We have a increasingly significant role in sort of from and after and increasing our role in reentry, but our primary focus is as an alternative. And increasingly, I think you're seeing incarceration going down, not just in Massachusetts, but nationally. And so an increasing use of probation as the vehicle, as an alternative, method of the sort of the rehabilitation piece. And I think we actually know a fair amount about what works. There's a ton of research about social learning theory and risk, need, and responsivity, and effective ways to intervene with young adults. And the trick is to be consistent and apply it with fidelity. And what we're seeing, we're seeing a declining DYS population. We're seeing a declining DOC population, House of Correction population, and we're seeing effectiveness in our own data. And in 2 years, we've had a 53% reduction in the violations of probation filed in our juvenile population. It's not to that level, but similar kinds of reductions in violations in the 3 adult court departments that we operate in, both for technical violations as well as for new arrests. And so as a commissioner of probation, what that's telling me is that the things that we're doing are getting traction, that increasingly folks, young adults, are succeeding and completing their term of probation. And I think, I'll go back to sort of what I said at the beginning, that what's critical is, probation can do a piece of that because we're time limited in our involvement, and it's critical to have partners like the folks here and other folks out there that continue to support that development piece and continue to support, young adults in continuing that redirection of their lives into a much more positive and productive way. And, I think we are, the collaboration that you see here and I think with other partners is really a key to really getting traction with, this population, that it's a long-term developmental approach. And I think that's what you're seeing in sort of the reduction in reincarceration rates, and some of the long-term success is really the work that's represented, I think, at the table here.
Isael and Greg, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, I think, to the commissioner's credit, when we started talking about this, idea, a lot of it was, having, at UTEC, we don't use the word case manager, but transitional coach. So a transitional coach is the person that will stick with the young person once they're into the program all the way until they get into external employment, usually a 2 to 3 year journey. And that partnership, having a transitional coach be on the same page with the probation officer is huge. And so, our vision for this, and to the commissioner's credit, is thinking about this as a learning lab. What are the different practices we can try out? Some may work, some may not. We want to kind of develop this really as a learning lab. And so maybe it's a probation officer. We've talked about, being able to go with a UTEC worker while a young person is first incarcerated, building that relationship up. One of the things we do is our team, our street workers, unfortunately, the ones that meet a young adult on release day from incarceration. About 90% of the time, it's a street worker that picks them up. And usually they'll go, in Lowell we go to China Buffet. They do a China Buffet stop, home, and then probation, all right? And I think probation appreciates that, be able to, that relationship starts right there, right, on day one of release. And having the probation officer and the UTEC worker on the same page, the understanding, and then through this partnership, through this Learn Lab, maybe we're looking at joint trainings, right? We're looking at a positive youth development approach that's, consistent upon all the players. And then when things pop up, as they do, and you can speak to it probably better than I, but Isael has that really good partnership with his probation officer that through some of the challenges, I think they've been able to the UTEC worker with Isael has been able to kind of work through some of that as well.
At the end of the day, it's better communication with your probation officer. If, it just helps out a lot. Like, if you can't contact your probation officer, your TC can, and just let you know your status about what you're doing and how you are, just, it definitely works. It's a big impact compared to not having it.
Cool.
So this is a question for Erin, but everyone else can jump in as well. But how do you convince everyone else who might be dubious about the methods of how you work with young adults that this is working, and how do you face the challenges brought up?
I think it comes back to relationships and stories, because a couple of people have touched on collaboration and how it's so important. And I feel like the collaborations that I've experienced over the last few years are so much different than 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think the joint training, I think information sharing, I think these partnerships, like we do joint intakes with the district attorney's office through their diversion, and it just establishes this free flow of information for things that are going well, but also to prevent those curveballs that might come up, and also people that are willing to work with you if curveballs do come up, because things do come up. And I think for a long time we were siloed in our nonprofit world and system world and different parts of the system. And what I've seen so much more is this a collaborative approach where people are really trying to problem solve together, and then we can point to our partners in the system. And I'm going to call out Chief Ryan over here in the back. So Chief Ryan was a longtime partner of Restorative Justice, and as a chief, our chiefs would go and speak to other chiefs to tell them why they valued it, what had worked for them. And those partners in the system, or the district attorneys that we work with, speaking to district attorneys across Massachusetts and saying, this should be accessible to more people. This does in fact work. And if challenges do come up, here are some things we've tried in the past. And that collaboration, I think, is part of it, but then also the relationships and the stories are really what convince people, because we've found with circles that we can show people a video, we can do a training, we can put PowerPoint presentations together, but it's that experience that really is the conversion factor into whether or not people believe in the process. And so the people who've experienced it, we rely on them to communicate to the people that they trust and who trust them.
Now, DA Gulluni, I know when we talked yesterday on the phone, we talked a little bit about how so many of these collaborations and relationships that Erin had mentioned are helping you build this young adult court. And tell us a little bit more about how that came about and how this is going to be different, because I know there's only three other such courts in the country, and sort of just walk us through how this all unfolded.
Sure, I alluded to it in my introductory remarks that it started as a working group that was really a spin-off or a duplicate of what was and is happening in Chelsea, where we brought together certain partners, and the acknowledgement was we can do better with emerging adults based, again, on the brain science knowledge and our personal experiences. And that partnership resulted in really a focus on this young adult court as well as a young adult pod with the sheriff out in Hampden County, Nick Kochi. But the partnerships are critical. I mean, everything that I and my office have done is really based on partnerships and based on working with people and developing those partnerships to the benefit of the people that we serve. So I think in our group, we really started, on an alignment of philosophy, an alignment of objectives to do something better for emerging adults based on our understandings. And as I said, Probation is an indispensable partner. ROCA has been outstanding, and everybody has really gotten along. And I think it sort of touches on one of the earlier questions: how do you convince people, or how do you understand the risk that this involves? We were able to get everybody in traditionally oppositional agencies on board with this. Police departments are on board with this. It's just based on what I think is the product and the thoughtfulness and the way in which we've considered this process and this product, and then what we're striving towards, which is ultimately public safety. But getting to public safety has various means, and one mean here is to work with these young adults and give them opportunities and to try something different, because in Hampden County in particular, young adults are about 10% of our population. They represent 25% of our court population, essentially. In 2016, we had about 2,400 arraignments of emerging adults, and about 900 of those were for serious charges, 94C, 265, and 269, so gun, drug, and crimes against persons. So, and then they're recidivating at a much higher rate than older adults. So I think the partners came together acknowledging this issue and having a desire to do something about it.
And how do you convince COs and other folks who might be harder to lead to the water, so to say, that this is an effective approach? And what sort of models or best practices have you shown them from cities like San Francisco, Brooklyn, and Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, there's an aspect to this where, folks are going to have to get along and do this, and that's leadership in some ways. You're doing it against some people's beliefs, and that's the way it goes. We hope and we have a vast majority of support for the folks who are involved in this, especially in leadership positions. But I think there is demonstrated success. There's a few other courts in the country that are doing this. In particular, San Francisco, I think, represents the closest similarity to what we'll do in Hampden County. And they've had a lot of success. It's very different. They're taking in all different kinds of cases. In Hampden County, we have diversion programs. We're giving people opportunities. We're, again, with this particular emerging adult court, we're taking in high-risk offenders who are presented typically with serious offenses we expect and serious records. So I think it's leadership, and I think it's showing that this can work and that what we're doing to a large extent has not worked for this population.
Okay. And does anyone else have anything to add to this as well?
I just sort of echo, I think, echo both comments, but Erin's point about it's in a sense shared liability, I guess, in that, but it's also shared problem solving, which has been which I don't know about you guys, but it feels like a much better way to work, from my perspective, is that and I think it gets to what the public is asking for is results, and it's really the system is much stronger together than it is when we all are sort of doing our own things and not sharing information and not doing collective problem solving. And the system learns collectively from from working together and from our successes and our failures. And so in some ways, it's a systems improvement effort as well. But I think also it's the young adults experiencing a different system, right? So and that's an important thing too. Is if you're going to sort of change behavior and get people to then the system needs to model that change, and that's what I'm hoping that that the kids that go through these programs, our collective efforts together, experience the world in a much more coherent, supportive way, which common sense would tell us. Mentioned positive youth development. Kids that feel safe and feel part of something and have social connections, and which is in a way what we're creating for kids, difficult, challenging, worrisome kids, is a different experience, and it's really experience that changes behavior. And so it's system effectiveness, I think at its best, that we're working this way.
In a piece I neglected to mention is the trial court. Chief Justice Carey and Chief Justice Dolan in the district court have been phenomenally supportive and are taking a risk themselves. And the other piece is, and I think this is a piece of how the trial court sees it, we've had success in Hampden County and I think around the Commonwealth with specialty courts. We have a drug court in Hampden County that we started in 2015 that's working with people suffering from addiction. We have a veterans court, we have a mental health court, and they've all experienced, I think, great measures of success. So I think that track record for folks who may be dubious, Sarah, as you said, are saying, okay, it's working here, we can put this together, and we've dealt with other specialty populations, so to speak, we can do it with a group that really needs our help. This is kind of the next step.
I definitely agree. It's that success breeds success, because everybody's afraid to be the first. But I think what we are showing people is that these are not new concepts. They might be new to some people, but there is that track record. And then once, like I said, everyone's afraid to be that first, but then once others see that success, then they say, why aren't we doing it here? And that's how our organization grew, small community to small community, and then much more broadly, because people were saying, we want access to this too.
Yeah, I think, credit to so many different leaders. I mean, Massachusetts really is shining in the sense, I mean, the district attorney mentioned it, Chief Justice Carey is, really called out high-risk young adults, right? And we understand that from a variety of different lenses that can be risky, but that's where the return of investment is. And I think on the sheriff's side, I would just say, and I'm not sure if, Sheriff Kay will be sharing this as well, but and I think it's sharing those experiences, right? Having young people experience a street worker behind the walls, and then having that same person pick them up on release day and move forward, is now having conversations where we're having conversations now with a variety of different stakeholders to say mental health being a priority. And I think most folks will nod their head when we say mental health is a big priority. And the sheriffs will say, unfortunately, young adults who are incarcerated might get, just a little bit of counseling, right? And usually it's for, very acute issues, right? Because of resources and so forth. And usually, if you see somebody, that ends on release day. You can't see that clinician anymore after their release day. So some of the stuff we've been talking about is how do you have workers that can kind of straddle it, right? Have a clinician that can be behind the walls of a young person who's going there, have that person see that clinician, and on that release day, that same clinician see that person out in the community. Huge difference, and we've seen it at UTEC. And again, as a result of the partnership, I think I saw Representative Tucker here, who filed an amendment to provide resources for nonprofits to go behind the walls and do that. And with the leadership on the Senate side, I think I saw Senator Brownsberger, you're seeing new kind of resources, and there's some movement around that can provide that continuum of pre-release to post-release. And so we're pretty excited about that as well.
So we only have a couple more minutes before we open it up to Q&A, but Greg just made a really great point about looking to legislators on all of this. And there was the massive reform last year, but when it comes to youth justice, what would you like to see legislators assist further on, and what priorities exist? And maybe just keep it to one or two sentences. Let's go down the line, starting with DA.
More funding for the Hampden District Attorney's Office? Just an idea.
That could be subcontracted up to the Merrimack Valley.
I have to say, Representative Tucker, I know, is here, and there may be others. That they've all been very supportive, I think, across the sort of criminal justice system. I think the criminal justice reform package certainly has its ups and some things that I may quibble with. But they've been great. I think they're at the leading edge nationally on criminal justice reform, and I guess I don't have any specific requests beyond what they're doing already, and I'm very appreciative for that.
All right. Commissioner?
I guess we're going in order. So I think that, the criminal justice and the Council of State Government legislation and through the budget process, a lot of things have been set in motion. And, I think this fiscal year 2018 been sort of a learning laboratory for us in some of this. But I think what I'd like to make sure is that that this isn't one and done, that we don't lose momentum, that we continue to invest in and expand restorative justice. We have a pilot with Mass Health about sort of, Greg mentioned about mental health, but it's essentially I think community health center doing in-reach into facilities, doing intakes, and giving people sort of a health home and case management around medical and behavioral health needs. So sort of a more comprehensive approach to high-end folks. We'd love to see that expand. So I think there are a lot of things that set in motion. I think we'll learn from, doing, particularly speaking for probation, but we want to sort of keep that dialogue, and as we learn, make those adjustments, make those refinements, and, a lot of good stuff was put in place.
Thank you. Erin?
The restorative justice legislation definitely put some wheels in motion. There's a state advisory committee now that is examining, first of all, what does the landscape look like in Massachusetts? And then also, how can we support it and nurture it and help it grow? And so that includes resources. And the restorative justice legislation was enabling, which is a first step in the right direction. But we're also talking about, how to capture the data and how to make sure that we can find the resources and connect them to the places that need to provide the services. And as we move forward at the state level, I think we're also thinking about how to protect the people who are involved in the programs and the processes. The restorative justice legislation had confidentiality protections. And I hope that we continue to think about whether or not they're enough and where we can improve them so that all parts of the process can feel like it's working in a way that it needs to, so that it can protect all the stakeholders.
Thank you. And Isael and Greg?
At the end of the day, personally, I don't know much about this, but the fact that this is happening is, a step forward. So keep doing what y'all doing. All right.
You keep doing what you're doing.
I'll give him a round of applause on that. And I would just say, the work we're really honored to be doing in probation and the work behind the walls, to be able to continue to sustain that, and as the commissioner mentioned, this is a long haul effort. And we often say that if the dollar can follow the young person wherever they go, whether they're behind the walls or out in the community or in the schools, that's the conversation we'd like to be a part of. So thank you.
Great. So now let's open it up to the audience. How are we going to do this? We're going to offer some microphones to the audience. So if you have a question, just stand up and over here. Having a hard time seeing over the podium here.
I'm just gonna squeeze behind. I'm so sorry. There you go.
I was very glad to hear the mention of confidentiality because it's wonderful that the correction system is now coordinating as much as possible with the treatment and recovery system, but they have very, very different traditions. Unfortunately, we've got the mass incarceration tradition and the racism and so forth of the 80s and 90s, where it becomes really difficult is confidentiality. If a young person says, yes, I will join a restorative justice circle, there are stories of this going forward with probation officers, and then the young person being led off to jail because of something he has confided in the circle. So this is really important that we change some of the traditions, but if the probation department is going to get more into the recovery area, that there's a real work to change the tradition by re-educating not only and changing the culture in some way, and I don't know quite how you do it on such a big scale. But thank you so much for mentioning confidentiality. And also, it would be great if at one of these meetings there were more people who have been in the system. Now, great that you're up there, but it would be great if there was enough people so they could speak out freely at these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, for everyone, can you just please introduce yourself quickly and ask the question probably in 1 or 2 sentences for the sake of time, because I think we might be running into the next panel as well.
Hi, thank you. I'm Melissa McQuinney. I work for the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. I oversee federal funding for disabled, formerly homeless people. We're trying to expand our services to youth, to 18 and 24, and I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of homelessness going into incarceration and homelessness coming out. Thank you.
Before we touch on homelessness, can I just respond about confidentiality briefly?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I just want to clarify for people, I don't know where that story came from, but that's never been my experience. But I do want to just let people know that historically, over our last 2 decades of working, the confidentiality protections have been within contract with referring partners. So, for instance, the prosecutor's office or the police department that's referring the case, and those people promised not to use whatever was said in circle to prosecute down the road. And we've never had a violation or a problem or anything even fought over whether or not it should become admissible in court. I want to just clarify also that the statute, although it might not be bulletproof because, we know that attorneys, I'll speak for myself, we can argue anything, right? So it is good that we have legislation that protects confidentiality, but we want to do more to protect everybody's due process rights so that defense attorneys feel even more comfortable to advise their clients that this is a safe process and that what they say in this process will never be used against them in court down the road. That's all. Thanks.
Can I jump in on the housing question? So yeah, I don't think I'm going to shock anybody by telling you that our population in the criminal justice system is largely poor, and that homelessness is a huge issue. And so there's been an investment in fiscal year 18 that we believe will be carried over, if not expanded, in fiscal year 19, where at least in probation, we're getting involved in the transitional housing arena, and we're subcontracting that out. But just to address that you're not going to, all of the things that we're saying about working with young people, and you're not going to get traction if I don't have food, shelter, clothing. It's just noise. And so this has been sort of an eye-opener for us in probation because, just like we're, working with our other colleagues in the sort of the criminal justice end of the system, we're also sort of increasingly working with folks in the housing arena because it's such a basic need and it's such a fundamental issue in order for all of the other things that we want to accomplish. So actually, I'd like to talk to you.
Anyone else?
Yeah. Really.
Good morning. My name is Rasan Hall. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. I'm curious to hear you all's thoughts and what you all are doing to be explicit and intentional about addressing race and the racial disparities. We're talking about kind of early lessons, and for as much good as comes out of kind of restorative justice and alternatives to prosecution and incarceration, if we're not being intentional about dealing with race, talking about race, and addressing it, we can see an overall reduction in raw numbers, which is a good thing, but those disparities get exacerbated because white folks benefit more. So I'm interested to hear what you all have to say about that and what you're doing about it.
So Rasan, what I'm doing this summer, I don't know if you're familiar with the Healing Racism Institute of Pioneer Valley. It's a operation out of Western Massachusetts that deals with implicit biases and stereotyping. So I've been in discussions with the executive director there for a few years now, quite frankly, and just haven't been able to get it off the ground. But I'm going to train all my assistant district attorneys in the program that they provide around implicit biases, because these are decision makers, and I want to ensure, not that I assume, that this is a part of their decision making, but I want to ensure that, because we know all of us have biases. We all have something through our experiences, as you know, we see things differently. So we're going to put all our prosecutors through that training, which is a day-long training to talk about and be explicit about what our stereotypes are, how we see things, et cetera. And I think that's it's something that's going to help. It's going to start the conversation, to use your word, to be intentional about it. But I think it's also systems, it's data, it's making sure that we're watching what we're doing and who's going to jail, who's being put on probation, and whether there are disparities based on race and other factors, and just being mindful of that as prosecutors, as folks in the trial court system, and I think we all are. I think data is something that's improving, and if I could revise my answer relative to the legislature, I think data is a big piece where we're maybe lacking, especially as district attorneys. We often get data requests from agencies and from the legislature. We have great difficulty putting numbers together that are accurate and consistent across DA's offices and across districts. Our data systems are antiquated and really ineffective. So I think that's a piece, and we're getting better at that and getting better at using that data more effectively.
Would anyone else like to address this?
I just want to encourage anybody that's interested in this conversation for specifically restorative justice to look up Fania Davis. She just put out a book about a month ago, and it's a little book. It's part of the Little Book series of restorative justice topics, and it's racial justice and restorative justice. And she was a very strong civil rights activist, social justice advocate, and she talks about how the restorative justice community wasn't paying enough attention to this through the 70s, 80s, 90s, et cetera. And she really is talking about how we can work together to bring this to the forefront. And I can tell you that on behalf of C4RJ, we've made a commitment over the last 2 or 3 years to be intentional about diversifying our organization from top to bottom, the volunteer base, the people who are working in the communities on cases that are coming from their community, and also at a staff level and a board level. And so I just would love to make a call out there for anybody who's interested in helping us do this work. Our website is c4rj.org for the number. We invite anyone who wants to help us on this journey to come and help.
And I would just quickly say I appreciate the questions, and I think that we all need to be continuing to ask those questions at every forum, right? And I think that the combination of data, organizing, and policymaking together is a critical piece. And how do you combine that? You know, we've had the good fortune of partnering with a lot of folks around expungement. It was a start to that work, and there's, as you know, a lot more work as well that remains to be done.
I'll just say quickly for the trial court, so it sounds like sort of a bureaucratic thing, but it has really sort of tangible effects, and some of the things that we're doing in probation and as part of the larger trial court, but the trial court as a whole. So, we've been doing strategic planning work, and actually it's Chief Justice Carey's leadership, again, putting, racial, ethnic, diversity and equity as, one of the 5 major goal areas that we're working on. And, at least in probation, we characterize it as on both sides of the counter, that we want to diversify our staff, and we also want to have equitable treatment of the folks that we work with, our clients, the public. And so those are, sort of declaring that as a piece of work, and as, setting goals, and, I think better ensures that we'll make progress in this work as well.
Rashawn, thank you so much for that question. We have to actually wrap this up right now. Yes, of course.
So I just wanted to jump in on a couple of things. One is the issue around homelessness. And I just want to say that we as legislators really look to you folks as our partners. And in this case of homelessness, I would look to all of you to help with the idea of having all these homeless folks that don't have an identification card, because they need housing, they need jobs, they need lots of things, but they also need an ID to be able to get housing, to get job, and to finish their education, get into public buildings. So we need some help. Something I've been working on for quite a long time now, and we are really, I'd be interested in speaking to someone about this, because it is something that we need outside folks to help with. So that's one thing. And the other, I just want to let you know that one of the, a couple of things that really made it through the criminal justice reform legislation, one is that we have created a data task force, a task force for women who come into the criminal justice system, and that task force is just about getting up and running, and we're going to be looking at all the needs of the women. And there's also another task force that is related to juveniles. So these are all data serving possibilities to get some of the information that we need to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. And panelists, thank you, some of you, for driving all the way to Boston and for being able to take part in all of this.
Thank you for the kind words, Ben, and for the warm welcome. I'd like to invite the panelists to the table, if I could be joined by Carol Cafferty, co-director of the Education Justice Institute, Leon Smith, executive director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice, and last but not least, Yotam Zeira, director of strategies and external affairs at ROCA. So as with our first panel, what we're going to do is really start with brief introductions. We're a little shorter on time, so I'll invite my colleagues to take perhaps 3 minutes to talk about their work in this space of rethinking systems and reinvesting in young adult justice. Then we'll take a few questions to really dive into the substance of the work, and then time allowing, make time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So first, perhaps we'll start with Carol, if you could talk about the work you do at the Education Justice Institute to really rethink our systems and approach to young adult justice. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for having us here today. Again, my name is Carol Cafferty, and I'm the co-director of the Educational Justice Institute, which is located at MIT. And I co-direct with Lee Perlman. And what we're looking to do is infuse technology and innovative programming into corrections. And because what we've seen is that consistently one of the largest indicators of success is education. And RAND had done a study where I think they said it was about 43% less likely to recidivate if you've been exposed to some type of post-secondary education while you've been incarcerated. That being said, one of our key programs that we're working on right now is the Massachusetts Prison Education Consortium, or MPEC. And we received a grant from the Mellon Foundation through the Vera Institute of Justice to create the framework for a post-secondary prison education program. And I'm really happy at how things are going so far. We've had a great response throughout the Commonwealth. And what's really exciting is that we've had a diverse group of stakeholders who are very intimately involved with this process. We have corrections, we have Commissioner Dolan, who's very supportive of this, and Vin Laurenti from Community Corrections. Parole's involved, and we're partnering with the Massachusetts Department of Correction. We're also working with a few incubator sites, Boston Pre-Release Center and Suffolk County Jail and House of Correction, to work on our programs.
Thank you very much, Carol. Leon, your organization thinks not only about how to reform the juvenile justice system, but also how to think about the systems upstream that contribute to young adults and youth contact with that system. Can you talk about your work in that space, please?
Certainly. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leon Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice. We're a statewide organization that advocates for a fair and effective juvenile justice system through research, advocacy, as well as coalition building. prior to coming on as the executive director, I'm a bit of a juvenile justice system lifer. I started as a public defender for the Committee for Public Counsel Services and went on to work in private practice, not only representing juveniles in the juvenile system, but also representing young adults in the district and municipal courts as well, along with being an educational attorney, because as was previously stated, if we're going to talk about reducing recidivism and we're going to talk about better outcomes, we have to look at education, which in many ways is core and central to that.
And Yotam, we heard a bit about the work of ROCA, but you have had a more intimate on-the-ground engagement with the organization. So can you talk about your work in that space and ROCA's approach to relentless outreach and developmental approach to supporting young people on their path?
Sure. So good morning. My name is Yotam. I've been with ROCA for almost 4 years now. I think what we saw from the presentation by Zeira, just to kind of briefly relate to that, it's interesting. We were given an opportunity to focus on a group that, if you took any measure and said who will most likely recidivate, who will most likely end up in the criminal justice system for a long period of time, who would that young people be, and can you do anything with them, as opposed to just putting them in jail and hoping that they will be fine. And we, been around for 30 years now, 31, try to develop a model that really is very evidence-based and really pays attention not only to what you do, but as was mentioned here before, but also how you do it, in a way that is effective, in a way that makes sense to young people, and in a way that really reaches out to young people who otherwise are not will engage in any service. So this is the relentless outreach piece. This is the part when we actually go to young people again and again for 4 years, knock on their doors, engage with them whether or not they want us in their lives. Yeah, a little bit like stalking, but legal, as we often say that. But really the idea is, you can't wait. The risk that they will end up in jail is huge for a very long period of time. The risk that they will die young is very, very high. And can you do something different? And I think the numbers we're starting to see from this analysis, and very pleased for the partnership with ABT to be able to see also down the line more, is, yeah, you can actually see very different results. The recidivism numbers can be much lower than what we see from any other type of response that the system now develops. Violent recidivism, even though 85% of the young people get to us with violent arrest, and 45% of them come to us with a violent conviction, still very few of them are actually going back for a violent for a violent offense. So we keep learning mainly from our young people. They are the one kind of teaching us what works and what doesn't, and we keep learning from our partners, and many of them you've seen in the panel before, and we can talk a lot more about the kind of system work that we're doing and how we're hoping to bring this not only to the few communities we serve, but more broadly to other places.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to dive in beyond your particular vantage point into some of the knottier questions that we grapple with around this field. So the first is, does young adult justice require dramatic systems change, or is it possible to work largely within existing frameworks? I think the heart of this question is this reform work, or is this about reimagining the system? I would invite perhaps one or two of any of the panelists who have the fire to respond.
I think the answer is both, in a sense. So as far as existing frameworks, I think we have to look and take a strong look at raising the age, especially raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, especially as it pertains to school-age youth. Now, what do I mean by school-age youth? When you look at the definition of an eligible student in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and our education regulations, it says age 3 to 21, not 3 to 17, not 3 to 18, 3 to 21. There are just under 23,000 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who are in our public high schools, who are peers and our classmates with those older kids already in the juvenile justice system. And I believe for that particular population, especially in light of how much our juvenile justice system has shrunk in recent years. I believe we have the capacity to gradually bring that, again, school-age population of young people into a juvenile court system where they will be able to have access really to better and more appropriate treatment. I think we have to honor some of the great strides that our juvenile justice system has made in the way of both education and treatment. The work that Commissioner Dolan and Commissioner Forbes have done in ensuring that there is developmentally appropriate and evidence-based treatment for young people in juvenile justice that these young people could benefit from. I'm a part of the Emerging Adult Task Force, and we recently had a visit to DYS, and I was really struck by some of the successes that they've had with young people who are 18 and 19 years old on youthful offender status. But these were young people who came into the system very troubled, but yet they were able to, get on track and get their education. And now once they're leaving, they're going to be moving with better outcomes. So I think that creates an existing framework where we can serve part of that population. Now, as far as the dramatic system change, when we're looking at kids 21 and above, I think that's where we have to really rethink what incarceration is for all of those kids, starting at 21 and moving through the mid-20s, where the science tells us that they're still developing. And that's where I think we have to take certain principles that are present in how we treat juveniles and say, why would we not extend it to these young people? Again, the importance of education. We've had years and years and years of study that tells us what happens when young people don't achieve a high school diploma, don't get on a track to some sort of further education or a trade. We need to make sure that we not just treat education in our adult systems as a service to be offered, but as a priority and a core thing that is needed. We have to treat mental health as not just a service to be offered, but something that's core and foundational. We know young people in the system have tremendous amounts of trauma. We have to make it a priority to ensure that they have those services, as well as things like family engagement. As you move through the 20s, you need to make sure these young people are connected to their parents, but oftentimes their parents themselves. So how do you put those services in place that ensures that we can break some of these multi-generational cycles that are present as well? So I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to look at both of those responses.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add before we move on?
you
Sorry.
wanna, or-
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think until a few years ago, probably the answer would have been just try something different. The outcomes are so bad, the treatment is so bad, and you just have to try something different and see how that goes. And particularly in the past 2 or 3 years, I think there has been a lot of change, and that tells you something about that sometimes where the outcomes are the worst and where the things are the hardest, sometimes you always have the best opportunities. I mean, we've heard in the first panel, there's a lot of really exciting experimentation and early successes in different places in the Commonwealth. So I think this is kind of what's emerging as what's already happening. If you look nationally and even if you look internationally, there isn't one answer to what will fix the really bad outcomes for emerging adults, and you just have to try a lot of different things. I do want to say that I think the next challenge ahead of us in terms of policy, in terms of system change, is 2 things. One is how you take these early learnings and experiments and findings from things that are already happening and successful in the Commonwealth and turn them into something that is actually reaching everyone in different places in the Commonwealth, in all cities and towns, and really impacts young people not only if they're lucky to be in Lowell or if they're lucky to be in Hampden County or if they're lucky to be in Chelsea and be with ROCA. So I think that's one challenge. And I think the second challenge is really about what you do about the very high-risk young people. And this is what we're starting to look at and kind of starting to see outcomes for. Because what we keep hearing from a lot of our partners, from a lot of our justice system partners is we see fewer people, but the people we keep seeing have more complex issues, and we're not quite sure that the system is designed to work with them. So this is, I think, the next challenge.
Thank you. Did you want to chime in, Carol?
Just ditto to everything they both said, and I think that with regard to systems change, the juvenile justice system was designed for rehabilitation, and somewhere, somehow along the way, through tough approaches on crime and the war on drugs, is turned into more of an adult system with punitive measures. So I think that we're really in a great place right now, that we're shifting back. And again, to reiterate what was just said, education is such an important tool to change the trajectory of somebody's life and to give them hope. And I think that with a multi-systems approach, addressing intergenerational trauma, and providing the supports necessary for success, we already have so much of what we need, rather than creating existing, is more diverting them out of the system and expending resources at the front end, such as the example that was already provided with the drug court with the specialty court system. I saw Judge Hogan Sullivan earlier. So it's diverting resources into more prevention and intervention, so we're not spending money at the other end in incarceration.
Thank you. So perhaps for this next round, we'll get maybe one or two responses. So we have a question that I think in many ways, Yotam, you teed up, which is, do we need to rethink how we fund the justice system in order to support new models at scale? ROCA has been part of a Pay for Success project that has been looking at how to fund data-driven, proven models, and think about the sort of intersection between the private sector and the public sector in bringing those models to scale. So I'd say any reflections from our panel around how we might need to rethink about that funding scheme or structure.
I'm happy to take the question, but
wonderful.
So Pay for Success, we're still waiting for outcomes to come out of this. It's a long-term partnership with the state. There's some interesting challenges in analyzing the data in a way that is meaningful and in the way that we can actually draw conclusions from this. I think that what we're seeing from the work on the ground, and this is, I mean, this is why we're lucky to have evaluators like APT with us for many years, that we're already kind of seeing what works while we wait for more formal answers from these kind of contracts. I think if you look at the way that our system is funded these days, it doesn't quite fund what works. It just doesn't. There's very few things that are really going to the places that work. One of the greatest investment that I think has been very successful is the Safe and Successful Youth Initiative from the Executive Office of Health and Human Services that we've been very lucky to be part of with Glenn here in the office for many years. I think there's some the new funding that Representative Paul Tucker has just now added to the budget, I think is really important, and I think there are a few other examples. Again, the question is how you turn it into something more systemic and that actually invests in young people in a way that is effective, in a long-term way. Because specifically, if we're going to focus on the high-risk young people, it's going to really require an investment. It's not just going to magically change the trajectory.
Thank you. One thing that came up in the last panel was the quality and the of data to be able to monitor how young adults were navigating the system and to be able to really drill down on where there were disparities across the continuum. I know this is a theme that has been of great interest to Citizens for Juvenile Justice, and I'd love your thoughts, Leon, on whether you think our system is capable of providing the data and transparency necessary both to make these models work, but to make sure that all young people, particularly those who experience disproportionate contact, are truly benefiting from them.
Yeah, I think data is absolutely essential to any policy planning and into the creation of effective systems. Are we capable? Yes. I think what we all have to ask ourselves is, are we willing? Because data in many ways is a giant spotlight, and it really illuminates exactly who we are. And sometimes that means it reveals some very difficult truths that we then have to confront. And are we willing to confront those? I believe we all want a system that treats all children regardless of your race and ethnicity fairly. I believe we all want a system where it doesn't matter where. In Massachusetts, we are a commonwealth of tremendous wealth, but also tremendous poverty. We don't want justice by geography. That's why having data not only disaggregated by race and ethnicity and charge type, but also geographically and by county is so incredibly important. When I look nationally, I see that there are other states that are similar to us, like Connecticut and New York, which have county-specific profiles, which are looking at this data disaggregate on a regular basis. But I also see states like Florida and Iowa that are very different than us, and they are doing it as well. We are at the forefront. As a state, we are so good, and we're number one in so many things. So I know, and I truly believe that we are capable of having this kind of comprehensive data that will make us go from not just being really good, but being truly great at the systems we create.
Thank you. And finally, before we move to questions from the audience, we cannot talk about justice, criminal justice reform, without thinking about the deep roots of structural and institutional racism that are part of our nation's histories and legacy. So I would welcome thoughts from the panel on how does a young adult justice movement intersect with these deeper discussions around race, ethnicity, and institutional racism in our country, and what larger structural drivers must we tackle if we are to truly reimagine justice? In 2 minutes, a big question to close us out.
I don't want to take this one. My 2 cents worth on this is that, justice is equality, and until we get that across the boards, we won't have justice. And I'll move on from that.
I'll just say quickly, we understand that historically, we have race. I mean, Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century was race, and we are in the next century, and it still is a foundational issue. I'm going to steal from Attorney Hall, who asked a question earlier, and say that we have to be intentional. We have to be intentional in addressing race. Everyone who works in this system, in my opinion, whether you're a public defender or you're a prosecutor, whatever your role, should have that type of implicit bias, because we all have biases, every single one of us, and we all should be trained before going and working with these young people to be able to confront what's within ourselves so that we don't inadvertently create negative outcomes for them.
And I would just add that I think that many times justice is in the doing and in the ability to actually do something different. And I think I look at examples like, Sheriff Katujan starting a new young adult unit in his jail, giving his correctional officers a new opportunity to engage with young people, most of whom young people of color, in a different way. And I think when you give an opportunity to engage in a different way, it's also true for restorative justice. You open the door for change, and it's true for these topics as well.
Thank you very much. I think now we have time for perhaps 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Do we have mics? Looks like wonderful. And if you could.
My question for the panel is, I'm wondering if you could just very briefly touch upon the importance of courage, if you will, of our elected officials, more specifically district attorneys, sheriffs. District attorney just sat up here and mentioned neuroscience. He talked about implicit biases. He talked about the importance of data. That's historically what we don't hear from district attorneys. And I think that he and other elected officials take on a bit more risk in the fact that they are elected officials. So if you could talk about the importance of their leadership as it relates more broadly to system change, I think that'd be really important. Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think we're seeing in a lot of our elected officials, but especially our district attorneys right now, a tremendous amount of courage across the Commonwealth. And it takes courage to create change. It's very easy to get content, and this is how the way things are. But again, we're talking about our children and our young people. We're talking about the young people that we hope will one day be sitting on a panel like this when we've moved on. And I think that courage is more necessary than ever to ensure that we're able to get the very best outcomes for them.
And I would just say, we're big fans of Diego Gulluni in Hampden County. We've seen the work. We don't think that you can help high-risk young people make hard changes in their lives without working with systems and without working with the people who lead these systems. And we know that making change is really, really hard. So when I say a DA like that, when I see other DAs and sheriffs willing to make changes in their own systems where they're managed, where they're accountable, where they, where they're accountable to the people who elect them, I think it's a hard thing to do. And that's also true for elected officials at the State House. I mean, Representative Paul Tucker here is the same thing. It's going there and making changes for young people who really need this, and also being able to put yourself out there politically, which is really big.
There's another question.
Another big champion of young
Yes.
adults and young people in Massachusetts.
And then I'll bring it back.
So I love the idea of focusing on education, and I'm just wondering with young people if you're also including the families, the parents, or the whomever their charge is, because I think that's really important, because you need to have them on board, I would think, in order to proceed with an education program. So, thanks.
Yes, well, with our project, we're taking the holistic approach, and we have a very diverse group of people that are working with us from the community to promote and encourage the support system, whether it's through families or community-based organizations or healthcare providers. And again, we're working with probation, we're working with parole, so we can ensure that the supports are there and they will support the families as a whole. We are also working with the Massachusetts Workforce Development Project, so we can make sure the basic necessities are met, because as we all know, if you don't have food, clothing, and shelter and a solid support system at home, you're just bound to fail. So to create hope and to change the trajectory, most cases it's essential to have the families involved. Some, as we all know, might not be the case. It might be a bad situation. So I think it has to be taken on an individual basis, and we are moving more towards individualized service plans for people and for returning citizens. And with regard to our consortium, we're really excited because we have currently 63% is comprised of colleges and universities, 11% are comprised of corrections agencies, 12% are governmental agencies, and 14% are nonprofits. And we've grown by 185% since we received the grant in September. So the momentum is here. We have people involved from all corners of the Commonwealth that are coming to these meetings and participating, and we have some people here today. So I think that we now understand that it has to be an integrated systems-wide approach to address trauma, intergenerational trauma, to address bias and racism, to address severe mental illness that might have been untreated, and to really create a solid return on investment.
Yeah, hi, Marty Rosenthal. I was too slow in the last panel, but maybe this group could give me just as good an answer. My question is, to what extent do you see these kind of efforts leading to more diversion and people not getting arraigned and getting criminal records, and, which has been something that's kind of been below the radar screen?
So I think from a policy perspective, diversion and reducing the number of people who even engage in the justice system and are exposed to corrections and to all of that is one of the most helpful things you can do. We've seen a lot of these things happening in the Commonwealth. I think we're seeing now, particularly in Suffolk County, a lot of this work happening most recently with juveniles, and for this group, I think even more exciting, there's a commitment from the DA now to also work on diversion for emerging adults, which is really new and I think also really important.
And sir, I would just add to that in Middlesex County, DA Ryan has done a phenomenal job with diversion, not just for juveniles, but for young adults as well. So we have thriving diversion models that are working, and I think that's amazing because those are models that potentially can be replicated in other places as well.
And I would just like to add in on that on a smaller scale, I think when we are rehumanizing larger populations, when we put a face on this and we introduce people to somebody who has succeeded and who is doing really well, people aren't as nervous and afraid to invest and to change their way of thinking about this. So I think having people sit at the table that have gone through the system that are doing really well are the strongest advertisements for this.
No, join me in thanking our wonderful panelists